Greetings, church. Well, this evening, in the name of the Lord, I'm going to attempt to deliver evolution in the animal kingdom. And it's really just going to basically piggyback on what we've been learning all of the days leading into VBS. Everyone who knows me knows I'm not a science guy, I'm more a finance guy by profession. So we're going to do this one by defending the faith strictly in Christ. Okay? Now, what we've seen thus far in these past few days is that the Bible does not allow for evolution for truth, right? For it to be the truth. We've recognized thus far from what's been taught to us that evolution has been debunked, and we're even going to go further into that this evening. So if that is the case, right, that the Bible does not allow for evolution to be true, so theistic evolution isn't an option at all, for starters. Therefore, either creation is true, or godless evolution is true. But as we've seen on previous nights, there are no evidence to support self-creation of the universe, matter, or energy of the laws of science. Nor is there evidence that the universe is as old as required by evolutionary theory. In fact, there is scientific evidence which just easily prove and support for the young universe. And yet evolution is still accepted across the board. This evening, you're going to see a lot of conversations that take place in universities, on the streets, or even to know about with non-believers as to what they think and how they think that the world was formed, how they think animals were formed, how they think animals evolved overall. Before we dig deeper into this lesson this evening, I'm going to actually start the lesson with a video, and then we'll expand further after the fact.
In the beginning was matter, and matter begot the amoeba. If there is no God, that is the series of events that is forced on a person. You see, you would have to suggest that the cosmos is all that there is, all that there was, or all that there ever will be. You would have to say that there's no intelligent, supernatural creator who brings life into existence. And so you would have to say that somewhere in the distant past, life arose from non-living chemicals. Now, there's a very serious scientific problem with this. It breaks one of the most fundamental biological laws known to humankind, the law of biogenesis. The law of biogenesis is very simple to understand. Bio means life, genesis means beginning. The law of biogenesis simply says that life comes from previously existing life of its own kind in our material, natural world. For years, people didn't think that that was the case, and so they naturally thought you could just get non-living chemicals to produce life. And they had examples for that. In fact, what they called scientific examples. They said, sure enough, if you will take a steak and place it on your kitchen counter in the middle of the summer and come back in maybe a week or two, do you know what you'll find? Oh, you'll find maggots that have spontaneously generated on that steak. And that was supposedly evidence of life coming from non-living chemicals. They said that's not all. If you were to take some old sweaty rags and you were to wrap them with some wheat and put them in the corner of a barn and come back in a month or so, you would have spontaneously generated mice and sometimes rats from the chemical properties of the air and the rags and the wheat. Well, several scientists were studying this and they thought, hold on just a second, we're not sure that these chemical processes are bringing about life. And they did some experiments. In fact, they're very famous experiments in virtually every biology textbook that you will ever read. One of them is by a man named Francisco Redi, or Francisco Redi. You spell his name R-E-D-I. His experiment was very, very simple. He simply took some meat, put it in a jar, several jars actually, and he put those jars to one side, and he didn't cover them or put anything on top of the jars. The other group of jars, he put meat in the bottom of those and hermetically sealed, airtight, these jars on this side, and then he watched. He watched as flies flew into the meat that was uncovered, and they tried to fly into the meat that was covered, and they couldn't. And maggots formed on the uncovered meat. Maggots did not form on the covered meat. And so he said, I think flies are producing maggots. Now, the naysayers of his experiment said, hold on just a second. Your problem is you didn't let air get into the meat in the sealed jars. And that's what it takes for spontaneous generation to occur, air to get into the meat. And so he said, well, let's try it again. Put some jars over here with meat in the bottom and no seal. Put some jars in the middle with meat in the bottom and gauze-like netting substance on the top. And then put the sealed jars with meat over here. Flies landed on the sealed jars, couldn't get in. Flies landed on the netting that was on top of the middle jars, and maggots formed on the netting, but not in the meat. And then over here, the maggots formed on the meat in the unsealed jars. So in 1660, Reedy said, I think that flies are producing maggots. I don't think that they are spontaneously generating. And everybody said, we think you're right. But then basically when they asked him, what about other forms of life? Can they spontaneously generate? He said, yeah, just not maggots. Well, that idea continued for about another 200 years until the mid-1860s. In the mid-1860s, a man came along that you're probably very familiar with, even though you might not know that you are. If you were to go to your refrigerator in the morning and pull out a gallon of milk or apple juice, on the side of it, you would read that it's pasteurized. What does it mean that milk is pasteurized? Well, it means that there's a process called pasteurization that was named for a scientist named Louis Pasteur. Louis Pasteur proved once and for all that life doesn't spontaneously generate from non-living chemicals. In fact, in 1860, 1868 or so, around that time, Pasteur did some experiments where he would put meat broth or hay broth in the bottom of a flask, and he would boil it. And then in the 1860s, they had microscopes, and they would zoom in on that broth, and they would see that before he boiled it, there were millions of swimming microscopic organisms. After he boiled it, it killed all of those microscopic organisms. Well, the interesting thing about this particular experiment was that those flasks had a special S-shaped curve. So air could get back into the broth, but that special S shape was designed to catch all microscopic organisms as they went through the neck. And it was very effective. It did. Some of those flasks he would keep for over a year and then break the neck off. The air would go back unhindered to the meat broth and microscopic organisms would form. Reedy, Pasteur, other scientists who did experiments like this proved once and for all that life does not come from non-living chemicals. In fact, evolutionist Martin Moe correctly commented that a century of sensational discoveries in the biological sciences has taught us that life arises only from life. Even the eminent evolutionist George Gaylord Simpson observed that there is no serious doubt that biogenesis is the rule, that life comes only from other life, that a cell, the unit of life, is always and exclusively the product or offspring of another cell. Now that puts people who don't believe in God in a very serious quandary. If this material universe is all that there is and all that there was and all that there ever will be, and life somehow in the beginning came from non-living chemicals, and yet every single scientific experiment ever done in the biological sciences proves that can't be the case, then what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is that there was a supernatural intelligent being at the beginning who brought life into existence. Now, what you'll hear from the atheistic evolutionary teaching is that we just haven't found how life came from non-living chemicals. We think it did. We suggest it had to. Like George Wald said back in 1950, he said, to make an organism demands the right substances in the right proportions and in the right arrangement. We do not think that anything more is needed, but that is problem enough. One has only to contemplate the magnitude of this task to concede that the spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. Yet, here we are. You see, he says, hey, this isn't possible, Yet we're here, so it must have happened in the past. So we've got to find out how it did happen. And yet here's the problem. It's not that science hasn't found the answer yet. It's that science has found the answer, and the answer is that spontaneous generation is impossible in nature. It's not as if one day we're going to find the answer, as if we do a million more experiments, it's still out there. We're just in a system or situation of doubt right now. No, listen. Every single scientific experiment in biology
ever done proves that life cannot spontaneously generate from non-living chemicals. About 50 years after Wald made his statement, Kenneth Miller and Joseph Levine, in their book Biology, wrote that Louis Pasteur convinced other scientists that the hypothesis of spontaneous generation was not correct. In other words, Pasteur showed that all living things come from other living things. This change in thinking represented a major shift in the way scientists viewed living things. Major shift indeed. If that statement is true, and scientifically it's one of the most valid scientific statements ever made, atheism cannot be true. And in the beginning, God is the real scientific answer.
That said, the short version of that is the first problem, as we've clearly seen there, well, we saw multiple problems. So the first one is life from non-life. Now, they basically tried to prove there, and multiple individuals proved this, we saw, from Pasteur, from Ray, what might have you. You clearly see that since 1960, multiple individuals went through time by attempting and trying to prove where life really originally came from. Which, and these are all in our sliding slides, the various things that we went through. Pastoral life theories, scientific reporting, and showing that life comes from life. And through these multiple lessons, or through these multiple exercises, we've actually came to realize that that can be the case. However, that actually leads me to one of the first things that I mentioned, which is the first assumption. Which suggests that the origin of life can be attributed to spontaneous generation. Now, with non-living materials giving rise to living organisms, this concept, also known as biogenesis, states the elements present on our Earth itself. It combines all of these elements and all of these various principles that biogenesis in and of itself cannot be present without evolution, or it is a part of that whole evolutionary process, quote unquote, as they would say. Spontaneous generation was widely accepted theory in the past, as it is deemed logical that life could be generated from non-living matter. Ancient philosophers and scientists believed that certain conditions, such as the presence of air, as we saw in some of these experiments, the combination of certain specific substances, could give birth to living things. And we've all recognized from these various theories and these various experiments, from decaying leaves and even worms in mud, that none of them would actually produce life. However, a scientist's knowledge and experiments and techniques have advanced over the years. The theory of spontaneous generation faced critical scrutiny, and eventually was proven false. The experiments conducted by Francisco Redi and later Pasteur, 17th and 19th century respectively, proved that the strong evidence against spontaneous generation. So think about this. Initially, a lot of individuals thought that this was the case. We went on with that thought. We went on by actually trying to prove if this is actually the truth, and we've actually recognized that it's false. So the groundbreaking experiments, along with further advancement in the field of biology and the molecular science, led to the development of the theory of biogenesis, as stated before, which states that living organisms only arise from pre-existing living organisms. The finding also paved the way for the concept of panspermia, which suggests that life on Earth may have originated from microorganisms or organic molecules transported through space on a concept. meteoroids, or other celestial bodies. In modern times, the search of the origin has focused on the understanding of how a series of chemical reactions took place to form that molecular structure. So with that being said, we're going to go into one of the first problems here, which is, and this is just basically going through a full conversation of how many individuals, would really go through this story in a nutshell of what we just saw. Here's an experiment to prove life coming from life. They recognize that by introduction of air, when it comes to maggots and various experiments, that life has to come from life. But where did the original first life come from? Now, when you look at this goes to a series of discussions between individuals. So where did the first life come from? Or where was the origins of the first life? As we can see here, this was a conversation that was taking place between a lecturer and the origins of, it's called The Origins of Life, evolutionary geologist, Robert Hazen. And he's made notable admissions. The origin of life is a subject of immense complexity. And I have to tell you right up front, we don't know how life began. And these are well-educated, well-respected individuals who have actually looked at things from multiple perspectives, but they still can't figure out where did life originate. And as you can see by this dialogue here that goes back and forth, they just couldn't figure it out. Evolutionist Paul Davies, he's a theatrical physicist and a cosmetologist and an astrobiologist and a professor of Arizona State University, writing in the New Science, that one of a great outstanding scientific mystery is that the origin of life, how did it happen? They still could not figure it out. The truth is, nobody knows. Evolutionist John Horgan, right, did not even try to veil his admission with an article. He clearly summed it up. He titled one of his articles, "Don't Tell the Creationists." But scientists don't have a clue how life began. Such admissions are quite telling to the individual that follows this role of thinking. For one to really think that I don't know how life began, and we're going to come up with a theory and just put a label on it, goes completely against biblical thinking, teachings, and our biblical belief as Christians. When you actually look at scientists going through various studies and various things to really try to find an answer, various theories to really get to the roots of things, and still can't find an answer, but yet still don't put a label on it. It's really a telling sign of what evolution is and what people's thoughts of evolution is that don't believe in Christ. So it really leads that what Davies and Horgan mean is no naturalistic evolutionist has a clue. Biblical supernaturalists, as they refer to us, on the other hand, now know exactly how life originated. And the answer harmonizes perfectly with the law of biogenesis. Unlike evolution, life's origins fairy tale. If one sticks with the evidence, he must conclude that to begin life, right, one has to actually come from it. Would it be rational, unscientific, and requires blind faith in evolution to think that one could just come out of matter without having some other life? And that in and of itself, and that thought process leads to the second problem, right? Which is when you think of the biblical supernaturalists as referred to there, as having the answers, as one may say, let's dig a little bit deeper into that. When one says biblical supernaturalists believe that the life originated through a supernatural act or the creation of God, the Bible specifically specifies in a few chapters in Genesis really where life starts from. And I really think that's where the truth in which I'm standing here really is going to be built from in the preceding things that I have to say. It really starts in Genesis 1:1, and it states in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The verse establishes that everything that exists in the universe was created by God. Now it further states, right, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 20 to 27, it describes how God created different living things, different living creatures, including fish, birds, lands, animals. But specifically, verse 27 states, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created man. Male and female, he created them. The verse reinforces the belief that human life originated from the intentional act of God's creation. I'll repeat that. The verse reinforces the belief that human life originated from the intentional act of God's creation. Biblical supernaturalists, as it's referred to here, view that the Bible's account of creation as a divine revelation, giving them confidence in the belief of God and the source of all life. They consider the scriptures as the ultimate authority of all, and the ultimate authority, and use that to support their understanding in life. And that, I think, out of all those scriptures, really, verse 27 really highlights the beginning in addition to verse Genesis chapter 1, verse. Now, it further goes on about life coming from non-life and how that really fits into this whole concept of where does life originate from, or evolution in the animal kingdom. Now, this goes through another quasi-dialogue as to what really takes place when you get to that point. Or how does that really fit into things? And as you can see, right, we do have a chance to arrive, get a chance by arriving at random something, which is one of the many bypolars of which life depends. The notion that not only bypolars put the operating program of a living cell together could be arrived by chance. Let's think about that for a minute. To think about life coming together and just spontaneously arriving is to really close your eyes and to think about an animal just forming without even seeing the baby, or to think about an adult without seeing the growth of that adult. Where is the progression? It's just some individuals just popping in. It doesn't really make sense. It's not scientific, and it clearly cannot be proven. Look at this conversation that we had in lesson 2 as to how life really derives from life. The arrival of life on Earth from non-living or non-life is problematic in and of itself when you think about it. But life can exist without an actual operating program that tells it how to function, how to move, and how to just exist through things. But the problem doesn't stop there either. What would happen if the first life could reproduce itself? Let's think about that for a minute. If the first life didn't need any other cell, didn't need any other body, and could reproduce itself, that thought could be a very hard thought to wrap our mind around when you think about it. Now, a famous evolutionist biologist, Richard Dawkins, stated in an interview with Ben Stein regarding the origin of life, he clearly states, nobody knows how life got started. We know the kind of event that must have been, as he states, but no one knows. We know the sort of event that must have happened, or we think we know, for the origin of life, but no one knows. It is the origin of self-replicating molecule. Now, obviously, the first life had to have already had some function, have already been there in order for something to really be reproduced, to continue such life. Stein asked Dawkins, right, and how did that happen? How did that life come into spontaneous combustion? How did that life come into being? And Dawkins clearly replied, I told you, we don't know. As much as we tried figuring this out, as much as we went through multiple experiments, as much as we have theories, as much as we have educated scientists that God has given brains to really think through things and invent things, we still don't know. Stein said, so you have absolutely no idea how the Earth started, how being started? Dawkins replied, no, nor has anyone. Now, this goes on in multiple dialogues. Like I stated, we have heard multiple times from individuals that they don't know. And the nature in and of itself is disappointing that the origin of genetic code is still as obscure as the origin of life itself. But for believers in Christ, and for those of us that recognize that God has died for us, we know that the origin of where we come from. All of these things are not. But it is very important for us to understand this. It's very important for us to wrap our minds around how others may think of the origin of life. Because without that understanding, we cannot refute it. Without that understanding, we cannot stand the truth and actually truly share what we believe, which is the truth, which is in Christ. Right? Now, it leads us further into this discussion into problem 3, which is the origin of genetic information. Now, the Bible teaches that God created all living things, including humans, and replaced them in careful balance and harmonious in this harmonious world that we live in. When we think about evolution in the animal kingdom, as I was actually going through this scripture, it made me even realize that the Bible actually makes reference in certain parts about certain evolutions in animals. I mean, little did I know, and while doing this, that Jacob, for an example, when you pulled it up and you really dug into Jacob and his flock, I mean, Jacob literally implemented a style of selective breeding, and the Lord actually blessed. So when I was actually diving into this and delving into this evolution in the animal world and where does the origins come from and where do we think about it, the Bible clearly shows us right there and then that when Jacob asks to own all the new off-colored sheep and the goats that will be born to Laban's flock, Laban agrees, and he quickly tries to treat Jacob. I mean, we all know this. Nevertheless, the Lord blesses Jacob on usual breeding practices. Little did I know as I was reading that it was really referring to a level of how animals are evolving and a level of selective breeding that the Bible is speaking about. Who didn't know that people would actually be knowing about selective breeding back then? But as we think about this third problem, the Bible does not mention the concept of adaptation to one's environment at all. For example, in Genesis chapter 30, verse 31 to 33, as I mentioned before, Jacob uses selective breeding techniques with the animals under his care to increase their productivity. This suggests that the adaptation and the selective breeding were recognized as methods of improving the characteristics of animals' populations back then. So it even showed, even back then, individuals recognized the evolution in animals, and they truly recognized who the author of these animals were, which was Christ. Furthermore, the Bible often highlighted the importance of survival and endurance in various passages. Individuals are encouraged to persevere and overcome challenges. This can be seen in the passage like James chapter 1, verse 12, where it says, "Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, the person will receive a crown of life." The concept can be aligned with the idea that those individuals or organisms that are best suited to their environment and are able to adapt to the changing conditions are more likely to survive and pass their traits to future generations. Think about evolution in the animal kingdom right there in that level of concept, or one may think of that as somewhat of a survival of the fittest type of approach. Now, the origin of life, on the other hand, is a separate field of study known as biogenesis, which I mentioned before. Evolution somewhat covers some of this, but evolution, on the other hand, occurs when life has originated already. Life has already started. Once life exists, it can evolve through that process, which is what we're discussing this evening. And another process could be mutation, natural selection, as I mentioned, genetic drift, or other mechanisms. Now, over time, these processes can lead to significant changes in organisms, resulting in diversity of life as we can see today. Now, it further goes into some more mainstream evolutionary thinking, like we see here as neo-Darwinism, which is genetic mutation, natural selection, and the best fit species. Like I stated before. Genes must already exist in order for one to be mutated. Once a mutation does produce a major new raw material, as science goes. Now, as we go further, I want us to consider an analogy of making a digital copy of oneself. Right here. When one think of an exact replica of yourself, or you're actually considering the analogy of making a digital copy of oneself, think of like a computer. Think of a computer onto a flash drive. When a file is copied, mutation can sometimes occur with files. The file doesn't always copy properly. It doesn't always copy exactly. I'm sure sometimes we've seen this. The final copy isn't always exactly like the original copy. There could be differences. Condone errors, right? Duplications, translocations, deletions, and other mutations exist in genetics. Errors that cause the final copy to be mutated. Do such mutations add new material? And that indeed is the question. Do they write a new sentence? Do they write a new code? In the event that you're copying something and you actually have that duplicate, is that duplicate different from the original, or is it the same? Now, a mutation might cause a fly to have an extra wing, right? A homeotic mutation, or a person to have an extra toe, a polydiploid mutation, but mutations don't create a new creature at all. A mutation wouldn't cause a wing to appear on a creature. For example, unless the creature already had a wing in its genome. And the question one may ask themselves is, why is that the case when you're actually replicating animals, or when you're actually trying, or when animals are evolving in the animal kingdom? Really, the answer is because when a structure or a DNA or a molecule was discovered in the 20th century, James Watson and Francis Crick discovered the DNA storage. It basically stores information over time using 4-character chemical alphabet. It basically strings these things together, precisely sequence chemicals called nucleotide. Now, this basically store and transmit assembly instructions, various things, so you can actually move and respond accordingly to them. All right, it's pretty much like an information system for the building and the crucial protein molecules from the machine. So the body really has all these strings, all these molecules just really strung together so that we can function, so we can adapt, so we can move, so we can grow, so we can actually go on and actually mutate into other animals like ourselves. Now, information is packed into our genes. Yet, in the words of the information scientist Warner Crick of the Federal Institute of Physics and Technology, there is no known law of nature, no known process, or no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. Bottom line is, evolution has no way of getting life from non-life, right? In order to get life from life, once again, the evolutionists must rely on a blind faith and a blind position to fully believe such a theory. Which leads us into the fourth problem. And the fourth problem, as we see here, is insufficient evidence for evolution. Is belief a rational belief or a blind faith? And that's a question that one has to ask. Now, in this section, it really covers the approach of various types of ways individuals will go through to bring about levels of evidence. We see this in the world as we get into discussions with individuals that may believe evolution, or individuals that may be atheists. They have various ways of actually showing you a story, but not giving you the full story. I can prove something up to a particular point, but I can't conclude my findings. And a lot of this come about through erroneous evidence, irrelevant evidences, and inadequate evidence, as we may see many times. Now, erroneous evidence is referred to the evidence that is flawed or incorrect, right? It's leading to wrong conclusions about the evolutionary patterns or processes. Now, this could include misinterpretations of data, flawed experimental design, or incorrect assumptions. We also look at irrelevant evidences in this. Irrelevant evidences refer to the evidence that does not directly support the theory of evolution or provide insights into the evolutionary process. This could include unrelated observations or data that do not address the key concept and mechanisms of evolution. The third one would be inadequate evidence, which refers to the evidence that is limited or insufficient to fully support the theory of evolution. This could include incomplete or insufficient data, gaps in fossil records, or lack of comprehensive experimental studies in certain areas. While this type of evidence may not necessarily disapprove this evolution, it may limit our understanding of the ability to make definitive conclusions of evolution, thus make a sound decision. So, and some of these categories that we can clearly see just highlighted here. One of them, as we may see, and some of us may be familiar with this, the embryonic recapitulation, as we've seen here from Ernest Haeckel. He's lived in the 19th century and inserted embryos in their development in the womb. Repeat evolutionary history is embedded. Now, though his particular idea has been refuted multiple times, his idea became embedded in the evolutionary-friendly textbook. His claims were eventually found to be false. The entire thing was made up. Upon confrontation, Haeckel eventually acknowledged that several of the charts he used to promote his theory were fabricated to support his theory. Like I stated, that's a clear example of erroneous evidence. I mean, another example of this could be the horse evolutionary chart. Horse evolutionary charts, textbooks often use this chart. I've seen this chart in the past, documenting evolution of our horses from small fox-like creatures known as Eohippus, and several decades ago. However, this has also been proved to be debunked. It never happened in nature at all. This was also made up. Another one I'm sure we're all familiar with that I've seen before is the whale evolutionary chart, which basically states that whale evolutionary has been called one of the best documented examples of mammal evolution. And yet the entire timeline of whale evolution is now being revamped yet again. And this has been revamped time and time again, over and over again. Whales were historically argued by many to be descended from hippos until 1979, when that was proven to be debunked. Many have been, many have also stated the discovery of more bones over the years have caused scientists to completely change their approach to this particular thing when it comes to whales. Another one that I'm sure we're familiar with is the fossils, transitional fossils. It's in lesson 3. This particular one is an example that has been hailed as a transitional creature like a fish throughout the years. And it also takes liking to amphibians. A creature whose pelvic fins and front fins are thought to have been evolved into legs. That's what we're looking at there. And now this particular fossil, right, is called a stalactite. And it's a transition from a fish to a legged amphibian into a four-legged creature were already around and fully functioned 9 million years ago, before the scene even came about. So that in and of itself has been proved to be another category that we cannot side with. And it goes into even more. Category 2, the irrelevant evidences, one of which I will share right here, which is natural selection, like I stated before. When a species isn't well suited for a particular habitat, or another species is a less fit species, doesn't migrate to a different environment, that's also falls under the category of irrelevant evidences, as we're speaking about that. Another one to add would be geographic distribution and finches. As we see here. And 3, in the category 3, inadequate evidences, it really dives into a little bit more. Now, admittedly, one category of the alleged evidences for evolution stands as unrefuted potential evidence for evolution, as they state. The evidence is not adequate evidence. However, considering the same evidence can be used with better consistency to support the biblical creation as well. Homogeneous structures. Evolutionists argue that similarities in different life are every bit as much evidence for the relation to them as our similarities to human ancestors, as they say. Is it true that if we are related to someone, right, that we're predicted somehow so that we have some level of similarities? One would say yes. In other instances, some may say they may not have any similarities whatsoever. And as it goes right here, this is one of the clear things that we will see on a consistent basis, and a clear picture we would say is we as humans having similarities to the ape family or the chimpanzee family. In creation, rather than evolution is true, then similarities seen between different kinds would suggest a common designer, rather than a common ancestor. I'll give an example, a car manufacturer. When individuals manufacture cars, you oftentimes see features in cars that are pretty much the same. Tires, brakes, systems, windshield wipers, what might have it. Now, reinventing another car doesn't mean that that car will take the exact same features. It will have different features, but it's going to take on some likeness like other cars. Like they will still have the same tires, they will still have the same bulbs, lights, bulbs, brake systems, what might have it. So similarly, one would expect God, if he is our efficient engineer, and we all believe and we all trust in that, to use similar structures in many life forms on Earth. Since they were all designed to live in one and the same planet, Those designed to live in a similar environment to Earth and do similar things would be expected to have some similarity in species, some similarity in likeness. And as we go further in this, like I stated before, some of the similarities of some of the things there. And as we draw closer to this, we can clearly view that all of what we have studied here over the evening, right, that even if the Big Bang could create the universe and explain away all of the inconsistencies that we covered here this evening, we see when studying the cosmos at some point, in order for the biological evolution to occur, life had to come from non-life. If it wasn't a difficult enough feat that life had to be extremely complex, more complex than we might typically even realize, it had to have an operating program. That's one thing we all can agree. That tells us how to function, how to move, and how to put breath of air in us. It had to be able to replicate itself somehow. It had to be able to equip us with the necessary genome to allow life to continue. It had to have the pool of genetic information and had to be able to continually increase spontaneously over millions of years in order to allow a single cell organism to turn into all the species and the planet ending in a genetically complex species as Homo sapiens. If the evidence that we have had and the evidence that the Lord has put out thus far isn't enough, let's think about all what we've read here and what we've seen here this evening. We've seen scientists try. We've seen scientists make up things. We've seen individuals come up with things that have been debunked time and time again, but they never hold fast to the truth. But the one thing that remains as we go through this process is that God created us, and that can be proven. And that's one thing we can stand on. The pool had to increase in spite of the fact that there's no known way to spontaneously generate such information in a natural way. With such facts established, it should come to us in such a fashion that belief in evolution therefore requires one to hold a blind faith. In superstitious fairy tale. It's no wonder that the late Colin Patterson basically summed it up this way. One morning I woke up and something had happened in the night, and it struck me. I had been working on a stuff for 20 years. And there's nothing, I couldn't come up with an idea, I couldn't come up with a thought. I knew. That's quite a shock to learn that no one still can figure this out. No one still knew. No, of all the experiments they did, it still couldn't lead them to the truth, which we knew and we found in Genesis chapter 1. When we delved in Genesis chapter 1 and we wrapped our mind around it, we have seen that building blocks and building blocks leads us to the truth. Building boxes and building blocks lead us to the author of our faith, right? Which allows this transition in the animal kingdom, which allows this evolution in the animal kingdom. And everything here that we've learned from scientists was given so much to the world, but yet still not given the truth. We have recognized that we cannot hold fast in the belief of evolution. We cannot hold fast into the belief of science, into individuals being spontaneously combusted into this earth. We have to hold fast to what the Bible says, and we have to hold fast to who our author is on this earth. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.